Good luck, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
See you in a while. Lovely there, isn't it? Talking about that weight issue, getting out the door. Look.
Yeah, and if you could tell them that we're going now, yeah?
Right, they're just about to go.
Okay, whenever you're ready. Okay.
Okay, Mike Coomber, as Managing Director of Rivertrace, you're well placed to talk about pollution monitoring equipment and a lot of the issues surrounding that. And I'm wondering whether, from your sort of customer feedback, you're seeing particular MARPOL related issues of concern at the moment.
Yes, two or three things that concern our clients. One is the increasing use of magic pipe to bypass the oil water separator monitor, falsification of the oil record book, and service certificates from non-trained organisations.
And how's that impacting on the sort of feedback that you're getting?
Certainly with regard to the magic pipe discharges, they are without question increasing, and it's a wholly avoidable circumstance, really, that a little bit of investment by the ship owner or manager at the front end, they could alleviate any risk of fines and prosecution and being put on probation when they're caught. As for the illegal service centres that are set up, we come across them on an increasingly frequent basis. They're not trained. They're servicing the equipment on board a ship for a price, and of course, price is key in this industry.
Because picking up on the magic pipe, I mean, I imagine that the magic pipe situation is connected in a way with, for example, the servicing that you're talking about.
It is. I mean, there's over the years that I've been in the business, which is now some 35, we've seen a general demanning of vessels, an increase in compliance, so less people doing more, ageing ships, so old equipment to previous regulations that, quite frankly, isn't as good as the equipment that's now available. Staff training, poor staff training. These all lead to how do I operate it? Can I operate it? Is it working? If it isn't, and you've got 30, 40 tonnes of dirty water to get rid of, how do you get rid of it? You're being screamed at by the chief engineer, therefore these bypass systems occur.
And I think also fake certifications is a concern as well.
It is. I mean, under the MEPC, the law that we all abide by, this equipment now has to be regularly serviced. Its accuracy has to be checked at the next IOPP survey renewal, or 5 years, whichever is the earliest. Again, come back to cost issues. If you can get your piece of equipment maintained or perceived to be maintained at a lower price point, you're tempted to go that route. But these organisations are not factory trained. They don't necessarily have factory spares, and it's fundamentally against the law.
Now, you mentioned the law, you mentioned MEPC. In your view, is the law at fault in some way? Is it time to review some of these legal requirements?
It would be nice to review the legal requirements. I mean, we as a company operate within two of these MEPC directives, 10849, which is for the ODME system for the tankers, and the 10749, which is the oil content monitor that goes on the oil water separator. The irony between the two regulations going back in history, and I can go back to 83, is that the regulation for the tanker was always far stronger than it was for the oil content monitor. With the ODME for the tanker, it was always a system, a complete, integrated and interlocked system. So a discharge could not take place unless all the tick boxes were green. In the case of the oil water separator and monitor, these are just components. They're approved components, but they're put together with the perception that you've now got a system. But because it's not integrated and it's not interlocked, in my opinion, it's not a system and can easily be bypassed, even today.
But is that a fault of the technology, or is it a fault of the regulation?
I think it's a fault of the regulation. If you have one regulation back in the 60s and 70s, which had a properly interlocked, very difficult to trick bypass system, and then you have another regulation, which for general shipping for the bilge spaces, there isn't a system. I think it's a fault of the regulation, and it's been missed at every MEPC change. For example, on the ODME system, the valves have interlocks that have feedback, so if they're in the wrong place, you can't discharge. There's no such checks and balances for the oily water separator and monitor, because they are just components put together. There's no check of flow through the oil content monitor. There's no position feedback for the three-way valve. And these people on board, they're clever people. They can see the holes in this and bypass. So yeah, there's a hole in the MEPC 10749 versus 10849.
And we're talking a couple of weeks before the next MEPC. Do you see any chance that MEPC could in the future address these things, or is this something that we just have to live with?
I don't see any appetite. I think with what's on the MEPC agenda, I don't think there's time to revisit. I think change will occur in the industry. It already is, and it's being driven by some fairly big players. We have some great customers that have very tight environmental policies. So they look at things like annual calibration or annual exchange. They also look at increased assurance systems. And you have tanker operators, for example. ExxonMobil has been leading the way for the last 15 years in all its charter contracts, for example, whereby it insists that the approved devices, so for the ODME system and the separator monitor, they're run regularly, they're maintained on an annual basis, and they are maintained by approved service centres.
And you mentioned that in connection with ExxonMobil. Would you say that they're unique? Is this something that you would like to see rolled out across the whole tanker sector?
I would. I mean, it's there may be other operators, owners out there that are operating their own policies. This is the one that's been most publicised, and this is the one that we see time and time again in the contracts that we're receiving.
Do you think there's any future in the Internet of Things when it comes to some of these monitoring systems? Would that help alleviate some of the problems you've outlined?
I think it would. I mean, the Internet of Things is here to stay. The equipment that we and others make can easily be integrated into what we call increased assurance systems. So we, for example, have something called an e-orb, but there are separator makers and other monitor makers out there that have similar technology. And what that does is that effectively makes in the case of the oil water separator, a integrated and interlocked system. It also has electronic recording, can be connected to the ship's LAN, can then export a daily, weekly, monthly log file of all the discharges, and it can be used by the crew to then fill in the oil record book.
And do you think that would avoid some of the problems that we're seeing? You were talking about magic pipes, for example. If you had that sort of a system, would it mean that it would be impossible or more difficult to fake the logbooks, for example, and would it make the whole magic pipe problem go away?
It could make the whole magic pipe problem go away, because it's a logic-based system, and therefore if someone has manually manipulated a valve, for example, we would know, and that would cause an alert, and that alert could be instantly sent to shore to the superintendent. Could be sent internally on the ship's LAN to the captain. There are overrides that the captain could then employ. It should be seen as good practice, so it shouldn't be seen then, in my opinion, as a burden. It's there to actually assist the crew. They forget to make a record in the oil record book, they get tied up in other activities, then they go back and there are gaps. They can't remember what happened, therefore they fill things in manually. If you have an electronic log, then that's to your benefit, that's helping you.
Mm-hmm. The magic pipe problem is particularly prevalent with US Coast Guard. inspections and fines and all that sort of thing. They're coming down very heavily on this. Is that what you would see as being the primary driver for trying to tackle this?
Very much so. I mean, the Coast Guard should be commended in this regard, because in the early 90s, they took a zero tolerance to falsification of record book, illegal discharges and that kind of thing. And they have successfully prosecuted, I think, 140 companies of various types to date, with an aggregate fine of $470 million. That's a lot of profit for the shipping industry off its bottom line. And it's wholly avoidable. Relatively small investment at the front end will ensure a smoother operation, less opportunity to get fined.
But is that message getting through to shipping companies? You talk about these vast sums that the industry as a whole is paying out in fines. You wonder why they take the risk. What's your view?
You have some interesting discussions in sort of dollar terms. So, for example, say for $20,000, you could have equipment that avoided all of these problems, and could then be used as an aid to those on board, and to prove compliance. And the person you're presenting to might say, well, I don't have budget for that. I'd rather take the risk. Now, the risk is, if you get caught, it's a minimum mandatory $1 million fine. Whistleblowers have been encouraged by the fact that if they report an incident, they're in for 50% of the $1 million as an award. Plus, you've then got the punitive damages. So, yeah.
But we're talking a lot about sort of oil and water detection, but there's a great drive now, I think, towards more environmental focus on shipping. What do you see as being the next target of the environmental regulations?
I think the next target will be scrubber wash water monitoring as a regulation. It's already in draft guidelines. Even though the technical specification hasn't been finalised yet, all the scrubber makers that we're talking to are already installing various monitoring devices for pH, PAH and turbidity. Usually they're off-the-shelf instrumentation that was designed for other industries, and quite frankly they work extremely poorly.
So what's the solution there? Because if I mean, the IMO is sort of moving towards sort of goal-based standards. Is that, do you think, the way that it ought to be going on some of these monitoring systems rather than perhaps the technology? I
agree 100%. I think it should always be goal-based, because if you make it technology-driven and a particular technology is written into a specification, that, in my opinion, stifles innovation. Whereas goal-based has the opposite effect, and then you'll get equipment that is fit for purpose rather than designed to a regulation. A regulation can never, in my experience, be written to replicate what actually happens on board a vessel. So goal-based is the way forward.
And at the moment, your fear is that it's not going that way?
My fear is exactly that it's being driven by various lobbyists, and it's being driven down a very narrow technical path. And that will move 100% away from a goal-based initiative.
What can be done about that? Is there anything that the industry can do to try and influence IMO, I guess it would be, to go down a goal-based route on this?
Yeah, I think it becomes the job of the strongest lobbyists. He who has the strongest lobbyists invariably gets the regulation pushed in their direction. I think coming out to industry for more technically based appraisal of how to achieve a goal-based regulation, that would be a sensible move.
It sounds to me as though, from everything you're saying, it's a bit of a cost versus benefit analysis that the ship owners need to do, the industry needs to do, because a lot of this monitoring equipment doesn't reflect on the bottom line. And I guess it's a question of getting that message across that it's worth making an investment in these systems. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it's the continual drive for profits and that comes at a cost. So we've already seen that, cheaper vessels, cheaper manning, lower manning levels, and all the service of equipment becomes scrutinised. But I think that's a false economy. The engine makers had it back in the 80s and 90s, illegal service centres providing fake spares, engine failures, and then that was a 100% cost to the ship owner because the engine makers moved away, you haven't used our spares, and so on. I think it is a false economy. If you buy reasonably competent equipment, it all has to be type approved anyway, and you maintain it regularly, then you're actually going to improve your bottom line because you're going to be able to, in our case, get rid of the heavy fluids that you've got on board that you're paying to move, and therefore make the ship more efficient.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Very interesting conversation, and I think there's a lot to take away from that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.